what's really remarkable is how quickly it changed, because it's basically been in 8 years. It went from no Republican, can't even vote Republican. Poll workers don't even know what to tell you if you ask for a Republican ballot, to now this is a solid red district.
And so you say that you talked to a lot of people who were, socially conservative. I mean, that part couldn't have changed all that drastically just in 4 years. So it must be something about the Democrats and about the Republicans this time around that, spoke to them and didn't speak to them. Did people tell you why they didn't want to support the Democrats anymore beyond, the men and women's sports issue, for example? Which I know that was a big issue for a lot of people. People are like, this is ridiculous. We're sick of this. This is nonsense.
I mean, the main two issues are the same as everywhere else in the country, which is immigration and inflation. And also the intersection between those two, because people would talk about immigration and they would talk about how there's people coming across the border who are then getting government assistance while we have to pay these inflated grocery prices. So it was like the confluence of those two things. Those were by far the biggest issues. The other issue, which I mentioned in the piece, is for that's specific to Texas, is drilling. This is an area with very few jobs, and people drive to Midland, Odessa, which is 10 hours away, and drill on the Permian Basin, and that's a good career. And so like a lot of people are afraid the Democrats are going to take away those oil leases, and the Republicans will expand it. So that was probably the third biggest issue. The people I spoke to, I get the question I think you're getting at is like, why were they ever voting Democrat? Apart from the fact that there was that there was just unthinkable not to.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're so out of so out of sorts with the Democratic Party. But I think that kind of indicates how much the Democratic Party has changed in terms of becoming ideologically narrow and rigid in very recent election cycles. Because I think, as few as a few presidential election cycles ago, you could be a Democrat who's pro-life, who's uncomfortable with gay rights, who's not down with the environmental stuff, who's like on all these issues. You're out of sorts with what the Democratic platform is, but you're still like, well, it's a big tent. There's people who are from San Francisco and New York who are in my party who I don't agree with. But there's also a lot of people around me, including my family, my relatives, my friends, everybody I know, who have my same values and who have my same beliefs, and they're Democrats. So we're, they don't like, my suspicion is that they didn't look around at their party and think of it as, this is the party of these beliefs, and if you're not down with it, then you're out, because everybody they knew were Democrats who were not down with those beliefs. And then that has changed, obviously. Like it's become much more in both parties, but particularly with the Democrats, has become much more ideologically rigid and impossible to ignore, and to fail to recognize the fact that you are like not welcome and not in your element, and that you're in basically a foreign land at this point. So then and then Trump comes along, of course, and he doesn't sound like Mitt Romney. He doesn't sound like George W. Bush. He's talking about like, why are we wasting our money on foreign wars? He's talking about why are we onshoring jobs? All this stuff that like used to be stuff that that would have very much resonated with this population coming from the Democrats. People, like one person told me that actually was the chair of the Republican Party there, who told me that that it used to be that everybody would have framed pictures of JFK and President Johnson in their living rooms. Johnson was a Texan, and JFK was a Catholic, so they loved them for those reasons. But also they were big on civil rights and all these things. They were down with that stuff. So they were consistent with the Democratic Party with that. But now the Democratic Party doesn't stand for those things anymore. Now it's like, it's the Democratic Party who are like, oh my God, you're going to put Tulsi Gabbard in as DNI. You're going to pull out of Ukraine. This is off. This is a tragedy. This is a travesty. And it's the Republicans talking about economic protectionism. So that, I think, like, they found a new home within this Republican Party. So I think it's those things together.
Yeah. Did you get the sense that people were, like, really into Trump? Or do you think that it was more about a backlash to the Democrats and what's happened to the Democrats and, specific policy issues? Like, it's hard for me to figure out. uh, I feel like a lot of people decided to vote for Trump partly because of things like Tulsi going over, RFK Jr. going over, and just outright hatred of the Democrats and
Mhm.
like fear actually of what might happen under the Democrats. I know that there's also sort of a cult of personality around Trump too, and he also came out looking like this really kind of heroic guy and really kind of became down to earth, especially by doing, Rogan and Theo Vaughn and like and those kinds of podcasts. But yeah, did you get the sense that there was like a fandom around Trump, or that it was more of a reaction to the Democrats sort of losing their interest and their, allyship, I
I
suppose?
actually asked questions trying to get that at that specifically when I talked to people, and the sense that I got was that it was more of a reaction. I mean, if you ask them, "Do you like Trump?" They'd be like, "Yeah, well, I like this and that and the other thing about him." Um, but you'd have to ask, and there were plenty of people who expressed their reservations about Trump. But the thing is, that's not that different from any other Trump voter I've ever talked to. Like, people tend to think that Trump is this like cult of personality, and maybe he is. And but the Trump voters that I've spoken to, going back, to 2016, have typically, what has been very typical of a conversation I'll have with them, is they're like, yeah, well, he talks too much. Like, I wish he didn't. Like, he's constantly saying things that I wish he wouldn't say. Like,
Yeah.
like they're like, they're kind of embarrassed for him, but they're like, but like, he stands for the right things, and also he's kind of like, it's kind of like, fuck it, right? He's like kind of based, and so there's like, there's a grudging admiration for it too, but there's a clear ambivalence, and I heard from that from people there. I mean, there was one guy I talked to who just became Democrat Republican this year, and he was probably in his 70s, and he didn't vote for Trump. The first, no, actually, he did vote for Trump in 2016, but not in 2020. And then he did in 2024. He didn't like his personality. He was just like,
Yeah.
but he's all in now. He's like all in, 100%. So I think there was a lot of people who were like, yeah, he talks a lot of shit, and he says things that are offensive, and then they're like, and that's regrettable, but then they also kind of enjoy it, right? For the same reason that everybody else enjoys it, who finds it funny, which is the needling of the arrogant establishment people, and the way in which he gets under the skin. They find vicariously sort of enjoyable, even when it's like things that are supposedly like attacks on Latinos. By the way, nobody gave a shit about the Puerto Rico joke at the Madison Square Garden. It just like was absolutely didn't matter to anybody.
Yeah, I mean, I could have predicted that. That whole thing made me so angry, partly because I really like Tony Hinchcliffe and think he's hilarious, and I was like, you clearly don't have any idea who this guy is and what his comedy is like. This is his whole vibe. And also I just found it embarrassing, both not just for the liberals and the leftists, but for the right wing people who were also like, well, that was inappropriate. And I was like, none of you guys have a sense of humor. Shut
Right.
up. But
Like,
yeah, and who cares? He's a roast comedian that made a joke, and it was a good joke. A lot of people also were like, well, just wasn't a good joke, or it just wasn't funny. And I was like, no, it was a good joke. It was actually an intelligent joke, and it was funny. He was
actually,
actually making a good point.
when he clarifies it and defends it, that it's about like their overfilled landfills, it's actually, I found it less funny. Like, it's more funny when it was in the offensive way, which is like,
Right.
it's just a garbage shithole country, which I'm not saying it is. It's not even country, but I'm not saying it is. I've never been to Puerto Rico, but I know
No.
many Puerto Ricans. But like, that's like just an insult joke, and that's funny. But I was like, wait, if it's actually about like in like a domestic political issue with the garbage sites, that's kind of not that, it's less funny.
Right, right, right. The politicization of jokes does tend to ruin the humor. Um, yeah, I mean, it's just so yeah, it was very interesting to see how quickly the tides have turned because I feel like what the Democrats did with that joke would have worked in 2016 for sure to say, "Oh, look at this racist that, is at Trump's event." Um,
But it didn't work in 2016.
right.
They did do all that in 2016, and it didn't work.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I feel yeah, I guess I feel like I'm trying to think of when the race stuff was more effective because I feel like in 2015, 2016 is when a lot of the woke stuff really was kind of working, but I guess it was just working on the internet and not real life is what happened.
It was working on Bernie Sanders supporters, right? It was working on like on our side, like on our quote unquote our side being like the left back then.
Right.
The main utility of wokeness was to neuter the populist left wing of it that was rising within the Democratic Party.
Mm,
It was to shut down anybody who supported Bernie Sanders and rally them behind Hillary Clinton. It was a deeply conservative political tactic, and it worked because they were using deploying it on leftists who were like, "Oh God, somebody's calling me a racist,"
right.
that doesn't work with conservatives and doesn't work with like people who are just apolitical, who are just normies who aren't like freaking out about these insults. Um, but I think another difference is that I think in 2016, if people on the left or people who are just left of center, people in like liberals, truly thought that this stuff was like you can't say that stuff and that it was outrageous and that it was like a scandal. And I don't think people, yeah, I don't think even liberals believed it this time. Like Trump would say we're so used to it now, but and then also we've seen the way that it's received, the norms have shifted, and so I feel like it was just faux outrage. People be like, oh my, they go through the motions of being like, oh, he said that he's going to lose the entire Latino vote, but did anybody really believe that? I don't think liberals actually believe that. They were like, no, it's a joke. It's a joke. But let's try to make as much political capital as we can out of it, because maybe it'll alienate some Latinos, but probably not. But here's our Hail Mary.